We wanted to pick her up at her flat nearby. And when it was locked from the inside, we had to call the police and the fire brigade and the ambulance. And then we found her, just as I had foreseen in the picture.
Miss Otero, you experienced a very extensive and significant near-death experience at the age of 28 during the birth of your last child. Would you like to explain what exactly happened at that time?
Just as you said, it was the birth of my third child. It was a really wonderful birth, the kind of birth that every mother would hope for. My husband went home to spread the news. While I was still bleeding, as every mother does after the birth of a child, it soon became pretty clear that I was bleeding too much. And I was struggling with my destiny because I realized that something was significantly wrong. I was a trained nurse, and I immediately sensed that something was really not right. And I was thinking to myself, please, please let me live, at least until my children are grown up. That was my intention. Then they put me under anesthesia, and I was unconscious. The reason for this medical condition was that an artery of the uterus had ripped during birth. That was the beginning of my story, of this huge experience. Then there was this moment when I realized I was letting go. The anesthesia, of course, played a part in it as well. I saw the room and the people in it for a short glimpse. That was not important to me. I felt a sense of movement, gliding away, in a darkness with a light at the end of it. I was moving towards that light. It was a truly sensational experience for me, because I had the impression that I was flying forward and backward at the same time. It was absolutely extraordinary, really wonderful. It gave me a wonderful feeling of well-being. I suddenly reached the border of that light, and there I had an encounter with my grandfather. He had died as an old man when I was a child, but he seemed much younger than that when I met him. I suddenly realized that I was asking questions. And asking questions also meant getting the answers at the same time. It was all questions and answers all together at the same time. It was more an exchange of thoughts. I had the strong impression that it was an emotional exchange, coming straight from the heart. I also saw words in this environment, which was very bright and full of love and warmth. Those words were like flying saucers moving around in the universe. This was also a true highlight for me. And I realized that some words just passed me by, and others really went straight to my heart. I also felt that some words were coming out of my heart. It was really a communication at an emotional level, straight from the heart.
What kind of words were those? Were they big words, packed with a lot of meaning, or just simple words that we use every day?
Strangely enough, I cannot recall everything, but they were mostly totally normal words, like simple adjectives or adverbs. For instance, either. They were not specific words, but just words from everyday life. Sometimes I encountered one of them later on in real life, and suddenly I realised, oh, this is another one of those words. Just like a hint at me reaching a new stage in the course of my life. But there were no big words.
No special meaningful words?
No. This whole experience was like I'm standing in the middle of a story. I had the feeling that I was part of the universe. I was part of something huge, something a lot bigger than me. It was also very emotional. I had the impression that I was experiencing all existing emotions. I really felt them physically. It was not just an experience of the thoughts that were on my mind. Instead, I felt them physically and very intensely.
What happened next? How did this experience end?
I guess it was the end of the anesthesia. I just came back at some point. It was an abrupt end for me. I had no feeling of going back slowly. Instead, it was very abrupt. I'd felt extremely whole in this experience. I've always said later that I had never felt so whole as in this situation during my near-death experience. I found myself big and strong, and everything felt wonderful. And I came back from the anesthesia, and I had so much pain in my whole body. They could not find any areas in my body for giving me vital injections. I'd also been given transfusions, and all my limbs, my arms and legs were full of spots, where they had tried to get into my veins in order to save my life. This was extremely painful for me, especially since I was not even able to lift my baby. I was not even able to hold her in my arms. This was my first impression of coming back.
Was this experience like a dream, or has it had a big influence on your whole life ever since?
It has totally changed my life. This means so much to me ever since. It is still important for me today. It was important to me every single day. It feels like I experienced so much, I knew so much in this situation. I was also able to see into the future. This just came up later in my story. But I always have had the feeling that I took so much knowledge with me from this situation, also a thirst for knowledge, to come to terms with what I had experienced, and to be able to have this all at hand, the knowledge that I had experienced. And the huge feeling of love, of course, that is also essential for me. At first, I had no idea. This was a strange world for me. I had, at that point in my life, never heard of a near-death experience, and I had no idea what had happened to me. It took 11 years until I finally heard about the phenomenon of a near-death experience. I could finally identify what it was that had happened to me.
What was the time after that experience like for you? How did you come to terms with what had happened?
Very bad. I had no idea. My husband always says that I talked about it all the time, from the day it happened, but I was not aware of that. I suffered from insomnia. I was not able to sleep anymore. I suffered from extreme anxiety and panic attacks. I also suffered from suicidal thoughts in these moments because I wanted to feel this huge amount of love again. And here in this world, I didn't know why I was without it, really. Why on earth would I have to live without it? That was out of the question for me at the time. And I had no family support. I was absolutely alone with this idea. It was very hard for me. At the same time, the pressure that I must raise my children well. This was the only thing that sometimes got me out of the whole situation. I had 3 little kids under 4 years of age. Not really any time to think about things.
With your youngest daughter, you share another very important experience. After her birth, you repeatedly saw a visionary picture of a young woman that predicted a tragic fate. What did you see exactly?
It was a picture of a young person, naked, lying on scattered newspaper. It was obvious that this young person had experienced violence. Lying in front of a wooden shelf. And I had the idea she was not found for a long time. I was not able to mentally classify this picture. I had the impression that I knew this person. But I had no idea what it meant. It was impossible for me to grasp. This picture put me under immense stress. As soon as the kids grew older, every time they went out, I panicked.
But you were aware that this picture had something to do with one of your children?
Es war mir nicht bewusst in diesem Sinne. Aber meine Reaktionen waren.
I was not really aware, but my reactions were constantly the same, every time. My husband didn't know what to do with me. And I also had this constant idea that if we always made peace in our family, this horrible thing would not happen. I always used to say that I didn't fear my own death, but I feared the death of my loved ones. This was a very difficult time, because I could not come to terms with it at all. Only 20 years later, when I saw the same scene in reality, I realized that I had foreseen this whole situation.
Was that a kind of dream, or did you see it during the day?
Every time the children went out the door.
So this picture was constantly present in your life?
Yes, constantly. I was undergoing therapy, and then I stopped that because I thought I was actually doing better than my psychiatrist. But I also had no time for it anymore. And the older my children got, the worse it was. And they went out. Of course, children want freedom and they want to try out things. And they didn't come home for nights on end. And they stayed away from home without telling me where they were hanging out. Actually, I had reason to be worried. It was just logical that I should be worried. Strangely enough, I was the least worried for my youngest daughter. This is also remarkable.
When your youngest daughter was 20 years old, this vision turned into reality. What happened exactly?
My daughter
was going on holiday. 3 days before, she had asked me, "Are you going to give me and a friend a ride to the airport in Geneva?" She wanted to go to Barcelona. Barcelona was her favourite city. She lived there for 1 month. She used to go to school there, and she wanted to go back there. I was tired and not in the mood to give her a ride, and so I said, "Maybe I will give you a ride if I feel like it. Otherwise you will have to take the train." But then later on I decided I had to drive her, because I was thinking I need to talk to this new guy. Because my daughter had informed me maybe she would stay for more than the 4 days planned.
Nein, kommt nicht in Frage, dass du länger dort bleibst.
And I was absolutely against that, so I thought, no doubt about it, I will take her to the airport. This young man called me half an hour early and told me he could not get in touch with my daughter. I'd actually tried to reach her as well the day before and could not get hold of her. This was actually a bit weird because she was very communicative and she always called back. We wanted to pick her up at her flat nearby. And when it was locked from the inside, we had to call the police and the fire brigade and the ambulance.
weil es eben von innen abgeschlossen war, ihr Zimmer, ihre Wohnung. Und dann fanden wir sie, wie ich das
And then we found her, just as I had foreseen in the picture. She was only partially dressed, obviously getting dressed. She was lying on magazines that were scattered on the floor because she had not cleaned up. And the wooden shelf was in the middle of her room, dividing it into two areas. She had experienced violence before and was actually in a legal battle with an ex-boyfriend of hers. And afterwards we found out that she had been lying there for 23 hours before she was found. It was a really long time for her situation. She was resuscitated and taken to the hospital in Bern. She had suffered from a brain hemorrhage because of an abnormality in her brain that nobody was aware of. That moment when I saw her lying there, just as I had foreseen in this picture, for 20 years, I really felt as if a knot had been undone. It was really a picture of black and white for 20 years, and then the same scene in full colour suddenly. That is how it was. It was really absolutely identical.
Hatten Sie das Gefühl, dass nach diesem Ereignis mit Ihrer Tochter noch...
Was it possible for you to have any contact with your daughter after her death? Mentally or in dreams, in any way?
Das war sehr intensiv. Das war sehr intensiv, weil...
Yes, this was very intense. Stories exist that were really special.
Erstens mal, es war ja für uns eine absolut überraschende Situation, oder?
First of all, it was for all of us a very surprising situation. For me, it was also the question as to what I should do with this experience. Because the picture I had been constantly aware of had become reality. This was a huge relief for me on the one hand, but it didn't take away my grief. I can't say that the death of my daughter was a huge relief for me. No. On the one hand, yes, it was a relief from that stressful situation I had been in for 20 years. I knew this was lifted from my chest. But this was a new dilemma for me. This was very unique.
Das war schon speziell. Und zu Ihrer Frage, ja, ich hatte da Geschichten, das war unglaublich. Ja. Sie ist mir sehr präsent gewesen.
There were stories that were unbelievable. She was very present for me in the beginning. She was with us when we cleaned out her room. We had a ritual that we performed to clean her room. When I felt her presence, I had moments when I had to call my elder daughter to tell her a message in the words of my dead youngest daughter. And I nearly refused to say anything, because I actually felt that it was not me who was speaking. I felt that my dead daughter was speaking instead of me. And how was my older daughter going to react to that message? How was I going to go about it?
Aber ich glaube, die krasseste Geschichte ist die, als ich nach 5 Wochen wieder an die Arbeit ging.
But the weirdest thing was when I returned to work after 5 weeks. I was in an elderly people's home and responsible for training young nurses. There was a list with names and I found a new young woman on it, with the same first name as my dead daughter, Janine, and she was not on the list before. She had just come in after the death of my daughter. She also used to know my dead daughter when they were in preschool and in elementary school together. They were not close friends, but they knew each other. The thing was, they used the same kind of makeup. They had the same haircut. I could have said she was the perfect copy of my dead daughter. So I said to her, "You heard what happened. You know the whole story." and we are going to work together now. If you ever get the feeling that I am taking you for someone else, please let me know. And I will also tell you if it turns out to be too difficult for me. So that is how it was. Then suddenly one day at a coffee break, the nurses were talking about tattoos. I asked her if she had one, and she answered, "Not yet, but I'd like to get one." And then she added in the exact words that my dead daughter had used when she was still alive. "But you know, I'd like to get it on the back of my neck, so you cannot always see it, but I would still know it is there." These were the same words that my dead daughter had told me before she had died, on the back of her neck. So it was not always visible, but she would always know it was there. This was the very first tattoo that my dead daughter got. This really left me absolutely speechless. For me, this was a time when it felt as if I was given this other Janine, so I would be able to cope better with my story. I've always accepted that as a sort of present. But after 8 weeks, I had had enough. It got too much to have this constant reminder in front of me.
Losing a child is, for a mother and a father, one of the most painful experiences that anyone could ever imagine. Has your near-death experience, and maybe also your visionary picture, helped you in any way to cope with this immense loss?
Yes, this was very helpful. First of all, I knew that it feels good to die, that it means I was immersed in love. And I asked myself, who am I going to give my child to? Into whose hands? Ideally, someone who is really fond of her, who really cares for her, who really loves her. To really know she is in good hands and well kept in this huge amount of love was an immense help for me. I really would not know how I would have coped with it otherwise, because in my family nobody ever talked about death or dying, also not at all about the family members who had passed. This was always dealt with and done with after the funeral. And for me it was not like that at all. I also decided I could not just move on after my daughter had passed. That was impossible. And that helped me a lot with my grief.
How do you look at the topic of destiny or fate as a result of your near-death experience, your visionary picture, and your later experiences after your daughter's death? Do you believe in absolute fate and in the fact that everything is determined in life? Or do you think that we have to experience certain milestones in life, but that we actually still have the free will to determine the course of our own lives?
I felt that very intensely one week, while my daughter was still in the hospital before she died. I felt a huge feeling of fate. It was very impressive. I felt as if her story and mine belonged together. It felt like something that was identical. It was this feeling that my life and her life were different, but they were still connected. Today, I take it as a level of experience. It is determined. I think when I look at the world as a whole, yes, but we still do it all according to our own responsibility. We organise things without really thinking about it, so that afterwards I have to admit it was my fault and my own doing.
Ja, aber ich habe es mir selber eingebrockt, oder? Das heißt jetzt nicht, ich habe nicht mein Kind sterben sehen wollen. Nein, sicher nicht.
That doesn't mean I would have wanted to see my child die, but it has something to do with my story and her story. Today I can say that I would not want to miss this time in my life for the world. It was the hardest time in my life, but as an experience I would not want to miss this time at all. Because it has also shown me so many things in life. What is life? And life also has an end, always. And I also found a lot of meaning in this story. It is very complex and all interwoven, all woven together, all connected. This is actually what I experienced in my near-death experience. Nothing is solitary. It is also not just one vision, or one story, or one emotion, but all extremely bound together and extremely interconnected.
So you think we decide our fate by our own actions, but there are some milestones that we must experience?
Exactly. And I'm really convinced that we are here to learn. Life is really a school of life.
You are a member of the International Association for Near-Death Studies that is working to inform about near-death experiences. You are working in support groups for people who have had a near-death experience. Why are you doing that? What happens in these support groups?
I founded these groups actually really also for myself, because during the long years when I tried to find help with therapists, I found important people among them as well, but they were the only ones who did not think of me as a weirdo and accepted my story, with my ideas, with my perceptions. These people need people to talk to, and I believe it must include not only people with near-death experiences, but also with all kinds of perceptions. We always assume that others can easily understand us, because we wish it was the truth, and because it is wonderful when it works. But this is not true in general, not in everyday life.
Wir haben jede Person eine eigene Wahrnehmung. Und
we all have our own perceptions, and they change. But we all have our own patterns in life, and our own way of expressing ourselves. And if we can share that with someone, and this person says, I understand what you mean, there is nothing better in this world. Changed perceptions may be that we have become more intuitive within short amounts of time, or that we see or hear things that are not part of everyone's everyday life. Where do I talk about that? Where do I dispose of that? Where do I put that down? Who do I tell about that? And this is for me where I do that. And people appreciate it.
Talking about perceiving others more intuitively, you're working with elderly people suffering from dementia. Does it help to know that the person doesn't just consist of intellectual power, but there are other dimensions involved in being a human being?
Yes, and I really think this is a wonderful question, because this really is something that is so important to me. If we suffer from dementia, it doesn't mean that we are not fully human beings anymore. It also doesn't mean that we can't think straight anymore. But the processes involved aren't the same. And this is the source of a lot of questions when we deal with these people. To only concentrate on the intellectual level means that isn't possible. Then we cannot truly function as human beings, because we are much more than a normative skeleton with physical body and physical activity. We are much more than that. We are more than that. There is something alive within us, and that should increasingly become the centre of our attention.
Suffering from dementia means losing all intellectual abilities over time. Are you able to see the person behind this process, and can you actually sometimes reach this person?
Actually, I think this is one of my strengths. I've already worked as a physical therapist and as a registered nurse. And yes, I was able to do that. Listening is always the start of every communication, and not knowing from the beginning what exactly ought to happen. This is so important for these people. To give them room to express themselves, if only as the touch of a hand. I've spent hours just holding people's hands. I was simply there. And I've also heard the worst life stories of people suffering from dementia. And when I went out and came back later, They were back again at the level of their dementia. But certain things are still present. I think we should not just identify with a theory. They all have stories, and those stories have shaped us all our lives. And maybe this is the reason why they started to suffer from dementia, because they had no one to listen to them.
Fear of death and dying is not just a topic in the care of elderly people. It might concern everyone. From your point of view, have you found a way to conquer that fear?
I think it's a topic that concerns us all our lives. This is the way I feel about it. Getting rid of fear is wonderful in every situation. I wish people had a little less fear in this world. Being afraid of death is a natural fear that we all have, and it is also very useful. Someone once told me that it is actually very useful, because otherwise we would jump from every bridge at the least difficulty in our lives. And that is also not the right way to go. But I think we must embrace the difficulties in our lives a lot more. There is no highway in our lives. There are obstacles in our way. There are blockades and hurdles and all kinds of difficulties. And there are celebrations and joyful moments. All that is part of our lives, of every life. Sometimes I get the impression that we would like to throw all our difficulties overboard and get rid of them quickly. No, the more I can include these difficulties, embrace those difficulties as part of this life, the less I am afraid of death.
Umso weniger habe ich Angst vor dem Sterben.
Because a lot of anxieties are already dealt with and have evaporated. I think this is possible for everyone, but it is not an easy path.
Miss Otero, I wish you a lot of success with your work for the times to come, and I thank you so much for your precious input and interesting insights.